And once again, it's on the level of providing information to the community that otherwise would not get to the community. We're going to deal with issues in the news that have other stories behind them that never reach the general public. Our guest is Brother Dennis Speed of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, and our relationship goes back to when the real estate market crashed. Before that, he actually gave us a forecast of what was going on before it happened. And when it happened, it was like he was saying, hey, wow, man, forecast. So here we go. Brother Dennis Speed, we invited you on to give insight behind the headlines that deal with the Trump so-called impeachment hearings and also things that are happening on the international level. So the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me, sir. Guess it was a bit of a confusion on the time, but I'm good. How much time do we have? About 15 minutes, is that right?
No, you have the half hour. You have the half hour.
Okay. All right, very good. Well, then let me just start off by saying, like the first time we met and had a chance to talk, this is a similar circumstance when it comes to the financial world. That is, that sometime since approximately September 17th, there's been an unusual pattern of movement of money, large amounts of money, usually between $80 billion and approximately $120 billion every day since September 17th. This is being carried out by the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, what is happening is that banks are requesting that each night, or each day, in other words, at the beginning of the day, the Fed make available to them amounts between $80 billion and about $120 billion for the purpose of reconciling their overnight accounts. Now, there is a group of banks that are involved in these requests. They are not named, and you can't get any information on the particulars of what goes on. The only thing that is required to be released are the amounts and the fact that a session goes on each day in which this process occurs. In the past 3 weeks, what has happened is that this has accelerated such that there are often, not each day, but often as many as 2 sessions a day where the amounts have tended to go up. Now, this indicates that some one or more large financial institutions have failed, and that no attention is being allowed to be called to who that is for fear that the financial system would experience the kind of near meltdown that we had back in 2007, 2008. So I think that's the first thing I need to let people know about, because no one is reporting that, though you can get kind of indications from some institutions. Sometimes you'll get a report on something like RT or something which references peculiar activity at the Fed, but they don't exactly know either what's going on. So I thought I should first of all let people be aware of that, what that will mean in the near future, meaning within the year, is that something major will not be able to be hidden any longer. We are probably going to be looking at something considerably larger than what happened in 2007 and 2008.
Wow.
So I think that's the first thing I need to let people know about, because of the fact that it is something that will unfold in the future, but I'm telling you about it now.
Thank you. Okay. That's one.
Okay. Now, if we want to go, therefore, to impeachment, the issue of the impeachment then becomes far clearer when you know what I just said. Now, the reason that becomes a matter of importance to consider with respect to what we've been hearing about in these hearings. We've been hearing about the nation of Ukraine, and that would not seem to be where we started, because as everybody remembered, it was originally supposed to be Russia. What went on with that and the elections in 2016. But we moved to Ukraine. Well, the issue there is something that occurred actually about 5 years ago. It began with a coup that happened in Ukraine, where the former government of Yanukovych was taken over. Yanukovych, he's sometimes called, and he was replaced by this character, Yatsenyuk. And this was done during the Obama administration era by the State Department. Now, what's relevant about pointing this out is the reason for the coup. At that time, for about a 3-year period prior to that time, there had been this idea of incorporating Ukraine into the European Monetary Union and into the European banking system, basically. Now, they wanted to do this because they were looking for another area to loot. Ukraine is both important for an agricultural and mineral standpoint. And the idea was that it would become part of this more sort of extended transatlantic financial community, which is sometimes also called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The military and financial elements of these things didn't hang together. Anyway, what happened was that when Yanukovych, who was the head of government, had just been elected, he refused in 2011, 2012, once he saw what the conditions were going to be they'd have to accept from the IMF, International Monetary Fund. He refused to go along with it. And what happened was that he was removed from office in a process that involved something like what you see happening in Hong Kong today. It's along that same lines. Now, this was done as an illegal coup. The issue involved with respect to Donald Trump is that Trump has been pursuing an independent policy since he came in of trying to make deals, whether that's with North Korea, whether that's with Russia over Syria, whether that is the case of Ukraine and Russia, whether that's the case of Iran, where actually he wants to do something involving the Russians in the United States, because Russia is on the border of Iran. They can look at a map. Mm-hmm. So that's that. Now, why does he want to do that? The reason that Trump was doing this is because for whatever reason, he has a perception that he can make the trade deals, make the financial deals, and the economic deals, which are a little bit different in terms of, in other words, physical production carried out again by the American workforce, which would he ran on that, but that's not why he's doing it. The point of the thing is that rather than the wars, because the wars, strictly speaking, are all inflationary. They work very well if you work for the military-industrial complex. But if you're just in Ohio, in Akron, Ohio, or in Youngstown, Pennsylvania, or Youngstown, Ohio, rather, or you're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or you're in various of the areas of Appalachia, or some of these other areas, they don't work so well. There's been a contention between Trump and the intelligence agencies about this since he came in. Mm-hmm. Of course, he wasn't supposed to be elected. We all are aware that from the day he has first come in, there's been the assertion that he did not win the election. But what that's about is that those forces that had earlier made a decision that the way the thing was going to go ahead was the way that the Bush family had pushed America, that direction. And that direction was what we saw with 9/11, but we saw it earlier with the father, with the idea of population wars carried out in the third world, whether that be Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, or other locations, selling of the crack cocaine on the streets of America, and a kind of process where the United States had this globally extended military-based empire where the military bases replace naval installations like would have existed in the earlier British Empire of the 18th and 19th century. So that's the Bush design. But the Trump idea was that's not necessary. We can bring prosperity to our people by making deals with all these other people. And it's not a matter that there's not corruption in that or something like that. That's not the issue. The issue is merely that we don't have to have our citizens dying in an inflationary conflict where they aren't gaining. We may as well gain something here. So I'm saying to you that the actual backdrop of impeachment is not different than the same thing I said a moment ago about the financial collapse. It's another way of negotiating around that matter. So that's the second thing to recognize concerning impeachment. There are other matters that are important about it. Attempts to create regime change in the United States, as was stated by the head of the Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of England, whose name will come to me in a moment, Carney, Mark Carney. He stated that in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, at the end of August of this year, at a financial conference. He said that the time had come for financial regime change globally. So that's the second thing going on. And now I can move to Bloomberg when you're ready for that.
Go back to that last statement about financial regime change. Is that the phrase? Is that the...
Yes.
What does that mean?
Okay, here's how that works. Now we come to Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg, since 2007, has been a member of something called the C40 Committee, the Cities 40 Committee. It was a thing that was started in 2005 and was started by Ken Livingstone, who was then the mayor of London, the whole city of London. But he started it on behalf of the financial district of London, which is also called the City of London. This is one of those peculiar, very European things that Americans, generally speaking, don't know exist. There's a city called the City of London inside of the City of London. It's a downtown district about a mile to 2 square miles large. It has its own incorporation. It has its own sort of mayor, Lord Mayor, and it's got its own sort of administrative apparatus. It also has law firms and other guilds that go back to the 13th and 14th century. So whenever you will hear me in the next moment talk about the City of London, I'm always referring to that. I'm not referring to London City, the place that's got the 11 million people and got all the immigrants and what you would think about. It's like if I said New York City, you would know I was referring to the population. But if I say Wall Street, right, you know I'm referring to something different than New York City.
Got it.
See? Mm-hmm. But they got cute. They're cute, see? So they name it the same way, so like you don't know what it is, even in speech. It's hard to know, see? So Bloomberg represents a grouping of people that believe that the time has come where the nation state is completely over. And what is going to be the wave of the 21st century is that the world is going to be run by or through independent city-states like existed during the period prior to Rome, the Roman Empire. Let's say like after Alexander the Great. And then came in, and of course, the Greece was made up of those. The entire time when people talk about this, think about Grecian civilization, there is no Greece. There's a Greek language, and that's what's Greek. But Sparta is a different city-state than Athens or Thebes or Corinth. Right? All of these are different. They're all like states. In modern times, the place that you know is like, for example, Vatican City. Vatican City is a state.
Right.
Still is a state.
Right.
And there are a couple of other cities that call themselves free cities from the days when they used to be city-states, like Hamburg, Germany, for example, or Venice, Italy, for example. Hong Kong was basically really that. That's what the British were running it as. So Bloomberg's idea is that that's the wave of the future. And what you're going to do is that like New York City would be one too. It's a old design. It didn't originate with Bloomberg or with Ken Livingston. It's just that the society was created back then. And the first time it was actually put forward for New York City was by Fernando Wood, who was the mayor of New York City back in the 1850s, late 50s, when the Civil War began. And he actually proposed at the time that New York City secede, but it not from the Union. But it was not going to join the Confederacy. It was going to be a completely separate city-state, which was tied to the Confederacy. If people have ever seen the movie Lincoln, the Spielberg movie, Fernando Wood is the guy that keeps standing up, who's propounding slavery and as opposed to the 13th Amendment, who's from New York. And so Bloomberg is hearkening back to that slave Confederacy tradition of Fernando Wood. And what the purpose of this is that these cities are independent financial centers that in the age of cryptocurrency and cybercurrency disengage from nations completely. So the U.S. dollar or other such currencies are completely done away with the same way that you saw with the euro. And their notion is to create independent militaries, just like you see with Blackwater or that kind of stuff, which are connected by treaties to dying nations on the way to another way of governing the globe. So his candidacy is not actually for the presidency of the United States. That's why he entered so late. He also entered that late because it's clear that any of the Democratic candidates are unlikely to seriously challenge Donald Trump, whereas Bloomberg would have, because of the tens of billions of dollars he's worth, the ability to deploy $2 to $3 billion for the presidency, probably recoup that in various forms of tax breaks or other things, and buy it if necessary, or if not, if he can't get there because he can't get the vote, he can promote the ideology that these people are part of, and that's called the Green New Deal. This idea of climate change is causing everybody to have to engage in carbon futures, carbon swaps, and this is a new kind of economy. And if you get in on it on the ground floor, from the standpoint of these cities, you become an independent financial state. And so that's where we're going. So this is being done in part to counter the emerging power of the continent of Africa, which between now and 2050 will become the center of world population. The Chinese are aware of that. Well, everybody's aware of it who thinks this way, but the Chinese are very aware of it. The United States is aware of it. London, of course, is aware of it. The city of London, that is, and the French. And so once again, this is a war about Africa. That would not surprise, I think, anyone listening. Shouldn't. And the idea is to corner the market. So when you hear about Bloomberg making his speech about how I should have stop and frisk earlier, this is merely shall we say, a token statement on the way to a new form of bamboozle.
Right.
Bamboozlement, right? And so the notion will be to try to buy a certain kind of impact and influence in the black community, maybe even spread around a few tens of millions of dollars within that zone, on the way to reshaping the globe towards this broader strategy, and using that as a way of once again attempting to financially subjugate Africa through that prism.
Dennis Speed,
yeah.
you mentioned earlier population wars. What do you mean by that? Population wars.
All right. Okay. Well, this is relevant because again, in the hearings in impeachment, you may have heard this gentleman. I believe his name is Kent. There were two of them. One of them was called Taylor. The other was Kent. Both of them were career diplomats associated, with Pentagon and with the State Department. And one of them, I believe it was Kent, referred to his mentors, Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Right.
Now, there's the National Security Study Memorandum 200, which was done in 1974, which was done under Kissinger's auspices, which called for population reduction, particularly in a set of states named in that document. There are 15 of them, half of which are in Africa. And then there's the Brzezinski memo, which some people are aware of from approximately the same period, I think a year later, talking about the necessity for controlling Africa. So population wars were the wars that, from the time of Vietnam, just after the Cambodia War, for example, which is one of these wars that Kissinger in particular both promoted and allowed to occur. The conflict in Lebanon in 1975, which Kissinger was almost single-handedly responsible for fomenting. These were early experiments in this zone. And then you had the conflicts of the late 70s, like El Salvador in South America. But then in the 80s, this really got into its own stride. We saw it in Panama, for example. We saw it in a different way in the Yugoslavia conflicts. But what happens in these conflicts is that the notion is population reduction. Create conditions where you spread conditions of three things: poverty, disease, and illiteracy, leading to depopulation. And if you look carefully at what the legacy is in Iraq, where 97% of the population was literate, that is, the nation of Iraq was far more literate than the United States at the time that we bombed it.
Right.
And we took it off. So that's what they're doing. So they have this as every place they go. You don't find circumstances. In other words, let's make a very simple comparison. If you look at Germany, 33 to 45, it's under Hitler. There is then an occupation of Germany, 45. By 1960, Germany is, it's called the German economic miracle, basically. And so over a 15-year period, despite the fact that this is where the war begins, and there are 20 million people killed in that country, and it's divided and all this other stuff, it's completely rebuilt. Go to Iraq. We invaded Iraq in 1991. So we're coming up on 30 years of being involved in Iraq. Even if we only take the 2003 occupation of Iraq, it's 2019. So if you compare the condition of Iraq and what the United States did in Iraq, where it announced it was doing nation building, and you compare that to Germany, 1945 to 1960, that shows you what a population war is. or depopulation wars in that case. For Africa, this is a big concern because by 2050 there will be 2.5 billion to 3 billion Africans in the continent of Africa. Most of whom, about 50% of whom, will be under the age of 30 or 35 even. 30 or 25 even. And naturally, this will be where the largest amount of wealth will be being produced on the planet. That would be, so the notion is depopulate it. Don't allow that. Reduce that population by at least 1 billion in terms of the number of people that would be there. And I should also say that this does extend in its implications to people in Europe and in the United States, because these policies often go badly. Look at what has happened, for example, demographically to the United States and to the white population of the United States as a result of the proposing of everything from birth control to the same-sex marriages thing, to the transgender thing, to massive drug use and so forth. The promotion of these things in the culture was thought to have a primary effect on people of color, which of course it has had, but it wasn't considered, just as with the opioid epidemic, that you're going to end up with an effect where you wipe out everybody. So it's not that these policies are always successful in the way in which the people that propose them intend, but population warfare is what we are seeing in the case of Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, of course, pretty clearly, and take Bolivia now. That's also another thing that's looked for there. Venezuela is a different thing. They haven't been able to invade there yet, but were they able to do that? Were that to occur? That's what you would see as a population reduction.
Okay.
Finally, just to point one other thing out. Yesterday in Europe, at a conference that our sister organization, the Schiller Institute, sponsored in Europe, there was a woman from Ukraine there named Natalia Vitrenko, who contended that the population of Ukraine has decreased between 1997 and 2019 by several millions. I don't have the transcript of the speech yet, but I will have that by this time next week. If people are interested, I could also get you those figures. So depopulation is the kind of thing that sort of gets out of control once you get it going, and that's what's happened in Europe.
Okay, in concluding this interview with you, Bolivia, what's underneath what we're looking at?
Bolivia? Yeah, well, the Bolivia thing is one of the most interesting examples. The Bolivian president, Evo Morales, the first indigenous president elected in Bolivia, and I believe that to be true for South America, had embarked upon an ambitious program that he started, I think now 12 or 13 years ago. And understandably, it took him that long to build up an actual political capability, to change anything. Because you have to remember that, look at Vladimir Putin, for example. He's been there since 1999, off and on, either president or prime minister. Look at Xi Jinping. Basically, he's trying to declare he's going to be there. And people say, well, yeah, but these are dictators. Well, if you look carefully at Europe, let's just be straightforward about this. You had kings and you had systems of kingship. And you're talking about cases where you're trying to lift populations upward. Now, what happened in Bolivia was Evo Morales committed that nation to the most advanced technological revolution in South America. And he got his people involved in refusing to become raw material suppliers in specific, and he wanted to go for advanced technology, energy production. So a nuclear power plant, which he had built, has being built. He had deals with the Russians and the Chinese. Now, when this multinational corporation came in there to try to get the lithium, which is crucial for nuclear-related technologies. They wanted to give them this deal that Morales refused. It was done like a confessions of an economic hitman thing. You know, you come in, you make the proposal, you tell the country you're going to do this and that for them. You get them to take out a large amount of debt, which he didn't want to do, particularly through the IMF. He refused that. And so what they then do, they coup you. If you remember, that's exactly how it's talked about, is that first he would come in the front door, as the negotiator, the economic hitman. And then if you don't accept him, then they bring in what he called the jackals.
Right.
And so the jackals come in, right? If they can overthrow you, they do that. If they can't overthrow you, then they assassinate you. And we didn't have to get to phase 3 in this case because Morales, probably correctly, abdicated along with his vice president, went to Mexico, and now there's a revolt on the ground by his people to bring him back. And so that chapter is unfolding, and we just have to stay tuned to see what happens there.
I just need you to repeat the scenario that mirrors what we got from Perkins' book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Bolivia, to build that nuclear plant, got money from IMF or?
No. They refused to take money from the IMF. See, the important element here is whenever you have a country, here's something that people can just check the history of. Whenever you have a situation where countries refuse to take money from the IMF, you will see that they will experience either overthrow or destabilization or an extensive denunciatory program in the press against them. The same thing was done by Ukraine. Ukraine refused to get involved with the European Union and the European Monetary Fund same way. They were trying to give them money, and Ukraine refused that. That was back in 2012, late 2012, early 2013. They didn't want to accept the conditionalities policies that were being proposed to them, and I believe in part that was also IMF. Libya was the same thing. Libya was a case where Gaddafi never needed to take money from anybody, and there was that was the reason that had to go. So they didn't need what happened in Bolivia was they made the deals with the Chinese and the Russians, and they had no need for the IMF. They had no need for any of the Western money in that way. None. And they were insistent that they would not take money from the IMF.
Okay.
The issue of the economic hitman approach is to give you money. That's the whole first step. Once you accept the money, you were told that it's done for infrastructure reasons, and you're going to benefit, and you'll be able to pay back, and there won't be a problem on the interest payments. But then that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen for various reasons, but Bolivia knew this. So, for example, China has operated in many areas of Africa from the standpoint of giving essentially grants, so that there is no payback in that regard. Mm. The reason that actually makes money for them, in particular, is they have a tremendous need for raw materials, but they also gain a market for manufactured goods. So, if people don't have the revenue to purchase anything, then nobody makes money.
Okay.
So from the Chinese standpoint, if they build that market among particularly people who are of that young, because Africa is the youngest continent in the world, then over a 2-generation period, this creates one of the most solid expansions of your sales capabilities of anything you can do. This is the opposite of everything taught in the West in the last 50 years. It's what made America originally the manufacturing center of the world. And they're just doing what America did between about 1876 and 1945, and then stopped doing by 1966.
Okay, so they've come up with a new model, which is actually a replication of what the United States used to grow and develop.
Yeah, that's right, except that they also used the centralization that came out of the Communist Party system, which was also used by the United States, but is almost never admitted. That's what Hamilton's economics did, and that's what was done by Lincoln in the Civil War. The centralized issuance of credit through the Treasury, United States Treasury, for capital improvements like railway systems. And then the idea is that you extinguish the credit. You literally burn the money after the task is over, and you've deployed the income, the actual literal dollars, if you want to put it that way, paper currency, for that purpose. And if you do that, then it's never inflationary. You can extend as much credit as you want, and you will never suffer inflation, but only if you do it by that rule. If you leverage it, if you start using it for other speculative purposes, or other than for the particular project for which it's issued, as soon as you do that, then you're into inflation and monetary controls by banks and other financial institutions, which is why people today think that money, economics, and money and finance are the same thing. They're completely, often opposite. Economy and money are often completely opposite to each other, and that's what the Chinese understand, and that's what Bolivia understood. And that's why Evo Morales was removed. But hopefully he will end up back there.
Okay, the last is going back to the Ukraine and the so-called phone call. That, let's say the phone call did take place. I'm not arguing one way or another. The fact that these guys here had overthrown the democratically elected government before this guy meant that they were going to support the Ukraine anyway. They weren't going to back off. What it did mean, possibly, is another confessions of an economic hitman. Meaning, if you, the guy who's a comedian or actor, whatever it is, if you don't do the investigation, we're going to hold up the money, and what is not said in the conversation, but the implication, I'm just dealing with a scenario. The implication is that the one following you will do an investigation, but it was no way that they would pull out of supporting the Ukraine after they had overthrown or engineered a coup against the pro-Russian president years before.
Yeah, but there was a different thing going on. Yeah, that's right. Except that the thing that was actually going on was Zelensky, who's the new head of state, wanted to negotiate with the Russians a peace deal because they're on the border of Russia. See, these people are not in a position to, quote, win a war against Russia. Ukraine cannot do that. And it doesn't want to be deployed as a state of NATO on the border of Russia for three reasons. First of all, because in 1990, well, even in December of 89, but by 1990, Secretary of State James Baker negotiated a deal with Gorbachev that NATO would not expand, that if the Russians pulled all of their troops out of East Germany, pulled them back.
Right, that was the deal.
250,000 troops.
Right.
Right. Yeah, that NATO would not expand eastward. Not only did NATO, then Bill Clinton expanded NATO because NATO ended at East Germany's border. So NATO was not in East Germany. It was not in Poland. It wasn't in Czech Republic. It wasn't in Slovakia. It wasn't in Bulgaria, Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. But in any of those countries, wasn't in Georgia. Look at a map now as where NATO is. It's in Georgia. It's in Estonia, or trying to get in Estonia. It's in Bulgaria. It's in all these countries. Ukraine is that's like where Canada is. So you know what that's like? That's like saying that Russia wants to have they used to have the Warsaw Pact. That's what they used to call the Warsaw Pact. And that was their alliance, like our NATO. So that would be like saying, well, we are friendly with the United States, but we would like to have Canada become a member of our military alliance, which is a military alliance against you.
Right.
That's what that's like. Okay? So what it is the head of state, Zelensky, who, after all, is a comedian, all right? I mean, that's what he is. That's right. So listen, look, we really we don't need to fight a war with Russia.
Right.
So what it is they get on the phone, and if you look at the transcript of the phone call, it's useful to look at the transcript of the phone call, because besides the fact that there are jokes in the phone call, which there are, there isn't any so-called quid pro quo, and even if there were, even that's not actually illegal if it doesn't happen. So what happened was that they had this phone call in 2017. In 2017. So supposedly the whole idea of the phone call is, unless you do what we say, we're not going to give you military aid.
Right.
I mean, that's what, right? Except the military aid got delivered, and he didn't do the investigation. So the problem is, even if he said it didn't happen. So there's no crime. You can say that he offered. You can say the president of the United States said this, and he was intending to commit a crime. You could, I guess, try to argue that. Except here's the problem: Trump never says that in the transcript. That's the other problem. That's why they're doing the thing with the whistleblower, but it's actually the whistle I overheard a conversation from somebody else. I mean, in other words, this guy or this person, we know it's a male, doesn't say they don't have a document. They weren't even on the phone call. They're saying they overheard somebody say something. So the issue involved here is a war and peace issue, which goes like this. Here's what it actually is. In March 1st of 2018, Vladimir Putin announced a whole other regime of weapons, whole new group of advanced nuclear weapons of various types, advanced submarines, and so on. And he said at the time, I would really think that people should try listening to me about this, because we're not going to threaten, but you have to understand, we have rebuilt our military. Okay? That's what he said in March of 2018. Now, if you're sitting here in America, you can look at that and say, yeah, well, so you said it, but what does it really mean to me? But if you're sitting on the border of Russia, that means something to you.
Got it.
So you need, especially when you have not done that, you don't have a budget to do that. So you need to actually know three things. Number one, can you make a set of peace arrangements with Putin? Number two, can you settle the conflict in terms of East Ukraine, which is what the issue was. Now, the East Ukraine thing is a problem, too, for another reason, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Number three, you got to know where you stand vis-a-vis the United States. And the problem is not whether or not the guy in Ukraine is going to be replaced. The problem for Ukraine is the guy in the United States going to be replaced? Why? Because if you replace the guy in the United States, then Russia sees that very replacement of Trump as a potential act of war against Russia. So you got to worry if you're in Ukraine about how the Russians are going to respond if Trump is removed from office, since there's an election next year. You know, people keep talking about the Clinton impeachment. That was the second term. They talk about the Nixon impeachment. That was the second term. You talking about trying to impeach Trump the year before the election? Why don't you just run against him and defeat him? See, so from a Russian standpoint, they're saying, no, wait a minute. These people might be getting ready to do something. So we got to see. So therefore, the Ukrainian guy, he just showed up. He's not Putin. He wasn't the head of the KGB. He hasn't been in charge of Germany from back in the day of 30 years ago. He doesn't have a black belt in karate. You know, he's not a master fisherman and all this other stuff. He doesn't know, 4 languages. He hasn't suppressed the entire Russian mafia. He hasn't. I mean, he just showed up in this. So the last thing he was is to have to figure this out, right, on the job. Because, that could be lethal. That could seriously be lethal.
Now, Dennis,
so that's the deal.
Dennis, you guys are going to come out with a systematic report periodically, keeping people abreast of what's going on that is not being explained in the general media?
Yes. This is called the Emergency Alert Service, sometimes called Alert Service for short. We are starting out because at the beginning we're doing a thing. I mean, it's a little expensive now. It's like $1.75 a day. It's $50 a month. We'll be going down once we get established. It's going to take about a year. I mean, we have already. We're producing the material. We've been doing this for 45 years, actually, as a daily briefing, which is an internal document just for the people in our organization. But given what has changed in the world of social media and also what has changed in the world of crisis, some people were talking to us over the past several months. And, they proposed, hey, listen, maybe you could do a thing where you can have, shorten up your thing. Maybe also have a voice, a podcast kind of version of it. And so what is underway and has been underway for the past month is a set of discussions and moves to do this. So we have done it. It's now, and that's what it is. So it's available. The Rouge Political Action Committee, if you go to that website, I think they have something that will indicate. And otherwise, Brother Leroy, if people are in touch with you, they can you can relay to me. And some of my colleagues, including my wife and so on, are handling, the fine tuning of this at this point. But it's already coming out. It is being produced and is available now.
So we got a live presentation of what people would get in print and be able to plug into what's going on in the world for their organizations, for their groups, etc.
There's another element of it. You're correct about that, but you can do it. What we are also hoping to do, is we're initiating something called the Committees of Correspondence. The concept being that we know that in the United States today, one of the most important contributions anybody can make, besides what we may happen to know, is also the matter of reporting news that's not reported, that people themselves are either making or have found. So let me give you an example of the function that I would see this performing. If you look at this whole issue of the shootings that happen in schools, of course we know that the shooters are overwhelmingly white male. This is clear. But one of the other elements that we don't know, okay, and you just don't have the information on, though it may exist, is apart from the ones that are being, because remember, the FBI definition of a mass shooting is 4 people have to die in it for it to be a mass shooting, okay? Which means if you shoot and wound 30 people, but only one person dies, that's not a mass shooting. So now, number one, we need to look at that. Number two, we have to look at, I think, two other correlations. One, drug usage, both in terms of the shooters, and video game playing and things like that. Not in order because we're going to say, oh, well, because the person played a video game, he shot somebody. That is not the point at all. But the issue involved is to do correlations, recognizing that they're not necessarily causal. And here's the final thing. Now, if you've legalized marijuana all over California, and you tell me that a 15-year-old, just kind of like he was completely normal, nothing was out of the ordinary, and he just came there at 7:30 in the morning and opened up a backpack or whatever he did and started shooting people and killing them. The question I have for you is, what do you consider to be normal behavior? That is to say, what nobody is considering here is, if you have a circumstance where 20% of a given high school, right, doesn't just, quote, smoke marijuana, but any of us who know what that means knows that's not a limiting factor. That's not a way that you limit things. People are smoking and they're drinking, for example. And, of course, they don't know, and they're also eating marijuana. And, of course, there's different biological and biophysical effects these things have because everybody's physiology is different. But if you have a circumstance, I'm suggesting, where let's say you may have as high or even higher, but 20% is pretty alarming by itself, then what constitutes a normal state of mind in the persons assembled in a classroom where also the teacher may be ingesting the same substance? In other words, what is the educational experience that's occurring and the psychological adaptation to that educational experience in that environment, including for the non-drug user? Because much of behavior is cultural. So the notion that the behavior of people that don't use the drugs just automatically stays normal, whereas the behavior of the people that do use the drugs is aberrant or changed or shifted, well, that doesn't necessarily follow. Maybe we are experiencing in the United States something completely different, which is something which is called or sometimes referred to as functional insanity. Like in for example, in Nazi Germany, where you'd have whole communities that were involved in the Nazi youth movements, for example, teenagers and all, and they would be like, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, except they were Nazis. So they thought of that as normal behavior, but it was really functional insanity. See, so has that occurred? So now that's the kind of thing that you would have to have a kind of committee of correspondence for. That would not be a thing that you could get by gleaning news media reports and then trying to triangulate them by saying, well, we think that this is a false report, but this one's probably true. Let's go to another intelligence source and see what they have to say. See, you would never find what I just said. You could never glean it because it has to come from live intelligence, which no news media outlet is even interested in collecting, nor could it. So the concept of the emergency alert service is much more of a cultural, in-depth look at the United States, along with political, economic evaluations.
Functional. What does functional mean?
Well, it means that, in other words, people can drive and they can make meals and they can, in other words, people putting out marijuana cookbooks, right? Okay. And, you can not to season stuff. And it's like the chef that got over there in New York, the dude that what they found in the bag. Maybe, I don't know, you debate or follow that story. I think he worked at Cipriani's, I'm not sure. It may not have been, it was some high-end restaurant. He was Italian. And he was found dead in Queens in this sack because the the woman he had, some prostitute or something he was with. But the relevant point is he didn't seem to have any problem. He was normally, he was talking to his mother, I think, every week on Sundays. And right? Yeah. And right. And one day he just didn't talk to her on Sunday, and she just got worried. And it was Monday, he didn't come in for work, and then Tuesday that they found him. So in other words, if you looked at that individual, you'd say, oh, I don't know. Why would I get alarmed? I mean, he is here every Sunday. He's talking to his mother on the phone. Wow. Clearly a responsible person, right?
Okay.
Yet, this is how his life ended, right? And then you find out that he was sort of involved over time due to drug usage or whatever in a certain kind of a scene. So now you have to reevaluate this whole sort of, at least an element of the whole gourmet chef, culture.
Right.
Like with Anthony Bourdain, right? Same thing. Anthony Bourdain, the joke that Dave Chappelle told for those who saw the special, about Bourdain committing suicide. Huh? And I don't know if people know, I won't go through it, but it just, Chappelle just says he has some black friend of his that died and lost everything, but like he never thought of that. and so the concept being that what Bourdain did, remember, of course, he had also famously been a heroin addict, and some other things. And again, he pulled himself out of that also.
Right.
Remember, before this, he sort of, and he had written 4 or 5 books. Clearly, a very talented person.
Wow.
So what is that about? You say, oh, well, you're judging that as being insane. Well, I'm saying the following, because you asked me what functional insanity is. It's a circumstance in which things appear to be normal, but then what occurs would have been easily identifiable by you or me in 1964 at a Malcolm X rally, as being an exemplification of why black people should get away from white people.
Wow.
See?
Got it.
See, in 64, you just would have heard something like this and said, well, look, this is the whole reason we talk about separation.
Right.
See? Today, right, it becomes one of these, well, we don't know how to really evaluate this because, after all, people make their own life choices, but see, that's what we say now. So that's what I mean. So the issue of the alert system is to alert people, literally, to trends, positive and negative.
Got it.
And that's the concept.
I got
that's
it.
The concept.
Okay. Very good. All right, my brother Dennis Speed of the LaRouche Political Action Committee. I want to thank you very much for joining us and giving us the news behind the news. And, this will enable us to spot the lies and the untruths that pop up. My brother, God bless you and your family. And thank you for joining us on the Communicators.
Very much, sir. Yeah, peace.
All right, peace.